Yo, Mark, how's it going?
I don't know how it's June 17th or a Friday, but it's good. It's good. Busy but good. So
Nice. Well, we'll wait for folks to trickle in here. Hey, everyone, welcome to Power Hour. I'm your host, Pete Kazanjy here. We're going to be getting into it in a second here. Really excited to have Mark here to talk about all things, you know, sales playbooks, mutual planning, all sorts of other fun and modern sales topics. But Mark, before as folks kind of trickle in here before we get the party truly started, any big plans this weekend? You got any travel coming up? Anything or anything happened recently?
oh, I wish. I am very excited. I have just signed a lease for a new apartment. So I'm going to
Oh
be
yeah.
leaving the Upper East Side, moving to the West Village. So I'm
Mhm.
going to be packing boxes, I think, for the next 2 weekends.
So
But
that's like the opposite of the Jeffersons, right? Instead of moving on
yeah,
up, you're
yeah,
moving on down,
yeah.
moving on down to the village where the restaurants are better.
Yeah, I realized I don't care for space or and location matters more. But so now I'm gonna have a hobbit hole where I'm gonna be, it's like a bowl in a china shop. But eh, it is what it is, right?
I love it. I love it. That's fantastic. Well, we actually just had Atrium just had this amazing customer event last night in Chelsea. So I'm actually in New York right now. That's why I'm not in the office. Most of the time, people see the office behind me when I do Power Hour, but I'm literally in New York right now in a hotel in Times Square because we had this amazing Atrium customer event last night at this bar called Jungle Bird in
Yeah,
Chelsea. It was amazing. They had the entire upstairs. It was like huge turnout. We had like 60 people. It was like
that's great.
super, yeah, it was super rad. We brought a bunch of like prospects, kind of like mid-funnel folks as well. Everyone was chopping it up. I think everyone had a really great time. I think folks were like pretty thirsty for in-person interaction, but people were pretty pumped.
That's
Wonderful.
awesome.
Well, we can get started here. So hey everyone, thanks for joining us at Power Hour here. I'm Pete Kazanjy. So just to kind of get things started, obviously Power Hour is really focused on Q&A. We have two sales leaders here with lots of expertise to really get into whatever your kind of most tactical kind of thorny questions are. We had a number of folks that kind of submitted questions ahead of time. But please do use the chat. Please do use the Q&A. Mark and I will tackle your questions as they come up. So for folks who are not familiar, Power Hour is hosted by Modern Sales Pros. MSP is the world's largest revenue leadership community for those in sales management, sales and revenue operations, sales development, related disciplines, all the sales nerds. It's our people. The community's mission is pretty straightforward. It's to create an environment where our 30,000 members can answer questions that they struggle to answer on their own, help them see around corners, just get better. Right, get better. That's what we try to do here. And so the way that we do that is through things like live sessions like this, which is great, through our robust online Q&A forum, and through in-person events. And for those who haven't previously been a member of MSP, we're going to go ahead and add you after this event here. Before we get started, just a couple of reminders. Power Hours really kind of focus on Q&A. Like this isn't like we're not going to be talking through like a deck or anything like that. The idea here is that we're picking the brain of the folks that we have available to us. And so you're here to learn. So please do use the Q&A panel. Please do use the chat, etc. We will tackle your questions. So with that, let's go ahead and start some introductions here. I'll give a quick intro of myself. My name is Pete Kazanjy. I am the founder of Atrium. Atrium makes data-driven sales management software. It exists to help sales managers, so AE, SDR, AM, CSM managers use metrics to improve team performance. Pretty cool stuff. Takes about 2 minutes to set up to get your world-class analytics harness for your sales organizations. We have about 300 customers. Yeah, it's fun stuff. So before that, I started a software company called TalentBin. It was a recruiting software company that was acquired by Monster Worldwide in 2014. And subsequent to that, I ended up writing a book on sales on startup sales called Founding Sales. So that's a little bit about me. I think about sales just a bit. Mark,
But
can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, and
Por
actually, I
favor.
mean, yeah, for sure. But actually, that book is how you and I got to know each other, right? Because I used it when we were actually first starting to think through Recapped, and as I was doing founding sales essentially, that like we took so much of what you did there. So appreciate you writing it. Hey everybody, Mark
which which
Fershteyn.
which is kind of funny because you have a background as a sales leader, but it
Yeah,
turns out that like going from being a sales leader where you have like 50 sellers or 100 sellers and like a whole marketing organization
yeah,
and product marketing or whatever is like so much different than being just like the first seller with like a pretty broken product, right? But yes,
yeah,
please give everybody more context on your background outside of Recapped
yeah, for
and now
sure.
Recapped.
Yeah, and it's no, it's crazy, right? You think, oh, sales is sales, but when you have a product that's built or not built and you're like the first one in the category versus something that has product
Mhm.
market fit, you're rinse and repeating, completely different muscles. But
Totally.
yeah, Mark Fershteyn, CEO, of recap.io. We're the original and number one customer collaboration platform between internal teams and their customers. So, I think a lot of people on here probably will resonate that B2B sales is complex. Right? There's a lot of stakeholders. There's a lot of moving pieces. Right? Everyone's chatting on a different communication channel. Like things get lost. Right? And so, what we've done is we've helped centralize everybody and everything in a single place and let them really create alignment between different teams. And that's internal teams, whether it's CX or SEs or AEs or CSMs, whoever it is, right? Anyone that's involved in the deal, but also bringing your buyer in to be a collaborative piece of the communication, right? So really bringing both sides of the table and letting them collaborate because we truthfully believe that collaboration is the future of sales. And I think
Mm.
removing friction is the number one thing that most teams can do. And they can do it pretty quickly if they put their mind to it. And so we really help teams create alignment, create a consistent playbook that they can follow on every single deal, and really give visibility into what's actually happening. And
Yeah.
the reason why Recap exists is that I faced this problem myself, right? I was a VP of sales. I was leading, a pretty big team. And, I
Mm.
realized that the difference between my A players and my B players and my C players wasn't that they were like bad human beings or, that they were bad at
Yeah.
their jobs. It's just that my A reps were really, really process driven and they had a framework that they
Organized.
followed. Yep, exactly. Right. Here's what we do. Here's everything I did. Right. And when I sold, I did the exact same thing because I knew like without a framework, my ADD would just kick in and I wouldn't get anything done. Right. So like I
Yeah,
had to have
exactly.
that structure. And so literally built, hired some contractors, had them build a version of Recap for my team and never thought this would be a business. Really just wanted to solve my own problems. And next thing you know, 10 of my friends start using it. We ended up getting some investor money and it kind of really just spiraled from there. So, but huge nerd of everything sales and psychology and tech and, um,
What was
really,
the
really,
maybe you could share a little bit about the size of sales organizations that where you've been a sales leader before and kind of like the sales motions associated with that. It was it Log Me In or was it
Citrix. Yeah.
uh Citrix? Got it.
Yeah. So started out actually as right out of college, joined as a BD at Citrix,
Mhm.
BDR, essentially cold calling. We were doing like 200 dials a day. It was, pretty transactional, like boiler room type, go to market and really just started expanding from there. Ended up moving into management pretty quickly. Realized that what I loved was taking teams 0 to 1 instead of, going 1 to 10 and really scaling. Like I loved
Mhm.
figuring out the first piece of the puzzle, getting into a place that would be like really functional and then moving on to the next challenge. So started moving more towards more complex deals, more complex products, more complex sales motions. And then actually
Mhm.
ended up moving into App Academy where I was, leading as that VP. And really it was a unique environment because I got to take some of the B2B lessons that I had and really put it towards um, a coding boot camp, right?
Mhm.
It was kind of like my chance to do good, right? Because what App Academy did was, which was unique at the time, was it was the first income sharing agreement model, right? So
Mm.
students would get into App Academy. It was really hard to get in, but they would only pay a percentage of their salary after they got a job. And I think
Mhm.
personally, I think that's the way education should be, right? Outcomes should be guaranteed and should be interlinked. It shouldn't be that you
Mhm.
pay $100,000 to a university whether you get a job or not. right? So I thought that was pretty
It's
cool.
like a lot. It's alignment. Wonderful. Well, we can start getting into some of these questions here. I think one thing that's like kind of really top of mind for folks right now, as folks are kind of seeing kind of like ripples in the market and what have you, is kind of like, hey, like what's changing and what's becoming like more important in kind of the current selling environment. What are your kind of thoughts on that right now?
Yeah. So I mean, I talk to sales leaders pretty much all day long, every day.
Me
I
too.
think so. We're in the same boat there. The number one thing that we're probably both hearing is that, you're going to have to do more with less, right? Whether headcount is being cut, goals aren't being cut, expectations aren't being cut. And so it's really, how do you maximize efficiency and output and really start, improving the things that are already working? And I think right now, like even more so than even 3 or 6 months ago, consistency and standardization is going to be what wins, right? So if you can, and there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but if you can take your B and your C players and you bump them up, or the average of your team, and you bump it up 10, 20%, that's going to be what really gets you across the finish line. It's not taking your 3 rock stars and making them do 5% more, right? Like they're already performing at the level that they do.
Yeah,
So,
can't do that.
yeah. So I think it's more than ever. It's going to be efficiency. It's going to be optimization. It's going to be standardization. And, at the end of the day, like every deal now becomes more important than it was ever before. Right.
Yeah.
In a frothy economy.
I think that the last like 2 or 3 years has like really made a lot of organizations like kind of sloppy, if you will. Because it's like, I forgot about that op. Okay, well,
There's
whatever.
more.
There's more. Hey, marketing, go like, spend another $500 on like Google clicks in order to like get another op in here, right? Which I guess the funny thing about that is like that should always be nonsense.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That should always be ridiculous, but like for whatever reason, and we've seen this with our customers, right? So, historically, one of the things that folks has been really, really, really focused on, or one of the kind of key use cases folks use Atrium for, is like instrumenting the healthy ramp of account executives, which is important, right? Like you want to be like monitoring like their op build, their pipe build, their opportunity stage progressions, all those sort of things. But it was kind of like one of those things where it was like, cool, we onboarded 10 account executives and we want to like bird dog this. Whereas now it's more along the lines of like, cool, we're like onboarding 2 account executives and we're really gonna bird dog this, right? Like we're gonna be like very minutely like focused in on that. And kind of like, and one of the things that, it's kind of felt lonely over the last bit, really beating the drum of like better sales management, as we describe it, like data-driven sales management. You should be focusing on like helping move your performers, your kind of middle performers up. And the way that you do that, of course, is you diagnose what their deficit is, because everyone's got deficits, right? Like you just figure out like this rep right here has like this hitch in his giddy up, this rep over here has a different hitch in her giddy up, and like that's fine, that's what we're here to do. But whereas previously it was just kind of like, and well, you know what, if the team, if the average attainment is like 70% across the team, that's okay, we'll just add like 4 more reps. As opposed to like, let's go ahead and
money, right? Like we have a limitless cash, right? So it's
as opposed to like, hey, this rep right here has a pipe hygiene problem right here, their number of untouched opportunities is like absolutely bananas, you need to get all over that rep and make sure that they're being more rigorous there. This rep over here has an activity problem, look, if we can't get you like grinding, like we're going to give your ops to somebody else. Right.
Well, and I think you bring up a really interesting point, right? Like so much of it is just, you don't know what you don't know, right? And so if I'm a new rep at an organization, like I think I'm doing a great job, but there's these other 20 questions that I don't even know, right? Who's involved, right? Who's the economic buyer? Who makes the decisions, right? Have they, purchased this kind of software before? Have, so it's really like just bringing to light that and doing it in a repeated way, right? Like, I think 90% of a manager's job is just being a cheerleader and repeating the same things over and over, right? Like,
oh my God. Yeah. Repetition. And when you when you like, when you feel like your tongue is about to fall out of your mouth and like your eyeballs are going to fall out of your head and roll around on the floor because like you kept saying the thing again and again and again and again, do it some more.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Which I think which I think is actually, I mean, one of the reasons, like we joke about this, but one of the reasons why people do that is because, you know, a B2B sales motion has a lot of ins, a lot of outs, a lot of what have yous, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times organizations do a pretty, especially like early stage organizations, because they're, you know, moving fast, running and gunning, do a pretty piss poor job of like documenting it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Documenting what the play, and like I'm even like, you know, like you could knock me for this. Like I'm pretty rigorous about like documentation and like operationalization, but like because I'm kind of like bookish, and like a little kind of like nerdy in this regard. Like the way that I had our sales playbook like documented was like a bunch of slides, you know, a sales motion training class for our new account executives, and then I had like a lucid chart, like a couple lucid charts of like, you know,
Yeah.
flow charts or whatever. But it's kind of one of those things where it's not really like, it's not like a recipe to follow. It's like you can like look
Yeah.
at it versus just like a step-by-step process. And I think that that's actually where kind of like collaboration software, like you're kind of describing, ends up being really important, because like what you can do is you can like take this like sales playbook that otherwise might be like ethereal or like kind of
Yeah.
like tribal knowledge or whatever, and then you like actually make it a bunch of like steps, and you're like, cool, here's the steps, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe not every step is needed for every deal, but like we're going to go ahead and put all the steps in here, and like, and then you're going to follow them rep,
Yeah.
right?
Which, yeah, I mean, 100% right. And it's like, it's the difference between giving you a picture of a cake and saying, hey, here, go make this cake. Right. Or like, or
Yeah,
we believe in making cakes here. Right. Versus, all
go
right,
make
you
some.
take an egg, you break it. Right. I don't know how to make a cake. Right. I'm just guessing, but like, you take the powder, you do this, right? Like you put it all, but like literally a step-by-step recipe of what baking a cake looks like versus, hey, we love cakes. We believe in cakes. Figure out how to make a cake. Right.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
yeah, and that's not really fair to reps, right? And to like, yeah, and this is, it's funny, like I love call recording, and you know, and things like I love call recording. We use Chorus and Gong because like we're insane. It's mainly because Atrium will pull, it's mainly because Atrium pulls data out of them. So we need to have a good data set. But like anyway, call
Yeah.
recording is like super fantastic. But then to pretend that like, hey, rep, and we do this, like we have like a pretty rigorous like call recording like exemplars, right? Where we
Yeah.
have you know, different sizes of organizations, different personas, and the different calls. So it's like, here's 4 disco calls with an SDR manager of a organization that like doesn't have a sales operation person. Here's 4
Yep.
disco calls with an SDR manager for an organization that has like a single sales operations person. Here's 4 disco calls with an SDR manager for an organization that has, you know, 5 sales operations people, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then we just do that for every persona. That's all well and good, and like it's great for the AEs to listen to that so they kind of like understand what's going on. But then to be like, cool, absorb those into your brain and then derive what the actual playbook is,
Yep.
that's kind of silly. So to like tell yourself a story that like you have a documented sales playbook because you have a bunch of calls that people can listen to is like,
Yeah.
you're kind of lying to yourself.
Absolutely right. Oh yeah, I'm gonna listen to this call. I'm gonna digest every piece of it. I'm gonna know every question that I have to ask while I'm active listening on this discovery, right? And like trying to also pay attention. Like that's not how it happens, right? So like it's great that that library is there, right? But like, how do you take that a step further? How do you enable reps, right? How do you give
Yeah.
them the blueprint really for success? And I think that's
Yeah. Blueprint's a great word for it.
yeah. Right. And it's I think it's also too important that you give reps freedom within a framework, right?
Yes.
Like here's, you know, the 20% variance that you should be doing, but you have the freedom to do that variance, right? We don't want you just being a script, you know, junkie that you just literally read line for line every single time. Like that's not fun. And that's not how you build a great organization. Right. But
Yeah.
there needs to be that foundation so that, you know, they have every chance for success. Right.
Yeah, it's funny, like what is it, the scarf model or whatever, the you know, the things that make people like satisfied at work, and one of them, that I think, is autonomy. The funny thing is, like, I think people like they kind of confuse what autonomy means in this regard. Like that doesn't mean like ollie ollie oxen free, right? Just like, like run around in circles and whatever. It's
Yeah.
because that actually like sucks for staff, right? Like, okay, go
Yeah.
figure it out. Like that's not fun, right? It's like being kind of like tossed off the boat in the middle of the ocean. You're like, okay, now what, right? Versus like, hey, here's your swim lane,
Yeah.
right? Let's go ahead and just like crank down this, and then you can use your brain in order to figure out
Yeah.
like execution within that, and then maybe optimization more largely, like, oh, I'm seeing
Yeah.
this pattern show up again and again and again and again. Maybe we ought to add a new thing to the blueprint or to the recipe or what have you, right? Like I'll give you an
Absolutely.
example. Like I think one of my reps, the other day, this was like a while ago, like 6 months ago, like someone asked him for an ROI model. And so like, I don't know, I was like driving somewhere, or sorry, I was like in the car being driven, like, and so I just like ripped out this ROI model really quickly around, like why Atrium would be like high ROI. Essentially, it was just around like attainment lift for AEs, attainment lift for SDRs, and the kind of like the kind of cascade based on like this much more pipeline is created as a result of better management and like, better activity, et cetera, and with the organization's ASP and their win rate, that would turn into this amount of money and and then like something around like ramping compression and so on and so forth. So the funny thing was like I made this asset and it took me like, I don't know, like an hour or whatever. And then I gave it to him and then I put it into our like resource library.
Yeah.
But then it kind of just like hung out there. And until recently, where someone like brought it up again, and someone was like, "Whoa, we have this thing," and I was like, "Yeah." And we had added like 6 reps in the meantime, and I'm like, "Yeah, well, of course they don't know that. Like, it needs to be in the recipe." So what we did was like we added it to our own kind of playbooking software to allow, so it's like literally right there, like, hey, like, produce an ROI model. Yeah, produce an ROI model. Like you can skip the steps. Like, oh, well, this cake that I'm baking right now, we don't want to put like the lemon in this one, right? Like for whatever reason, but you can skip this step if you want to, but at least it's there so someone doesn't miss it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, I mean, we have this conversation all the time, right? Like it's, things will change, right? But at the end of the day, like your go-to-market is your go-to-market. And so, some deals you're gonna have a POC. Great. Load the POC, component, right? Have that recipe ready and enable your reps to be able to sell that, right? And if I'm a new rep and I come in, I'm like, great, I have to run a POC. How the hell do I run that, right? Like, what does that look like, right? Like, what are the technical aspects of it? Great, like here's that recipe for it. So
yeah, exactly. One thing that I think is fascinating to me, I was doing this fireside chat with John McMahon the other day. It's just one of the founders of or creators of like Medic, who was the CRO at PTC. And it was it's kind of funny because it's like, it's very, very like, I don't know, it is old school, right? Like I don't mean that in like in a dismissive fashion. Like, it works great, and organizations like kick lots of ass using Medic, and force management is like has a very robust consulting business making it happen. But the funny thing about it though is like it's very much like that, hey, here are your needs that we've discovered. Here's the required capabilities. Here is what the decision framework is, the decision criteria is, et cetera, et cetera. And so obviously like collaborative selling software and like mutual plan software is like perfect for that, right? Because like, okay, we're going to document the, like, here are the metrics that you're trying to move, and like, here's the decision criteria, and here's like the decision process, and like, here's our steps, and so on and so forth. But the funny thing about it is that like, because we've got, this modern, or like, and not all software, but because we've got this modern kind of like SaaS delivery motion that a lot of organizations can like do like easy in. I hate the phrase PLG, but the idea of like, you might be able to insert into an organization in a small transaction, or kind of like, as you were saying earlier, like a lightweight POC or what have you. So how do those like kind of mix together, right? Where like if you have an organization that you can like self-adopt something, or maybe not self-adopt, maybe have a sales assist adoption sort of situation, where does the kind of like collaborative selling software kind of come into play there, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, everything has its place, right? Like, should you be running Medic on a $50 a month, MRR self-service deal? No, right? Like, get in, get out. I think it really all comes down to like, how much friction can you remove from the process? And what does that look like, right? Like that's ultimately what you're trying to do, right? Like, I always cite the example of Amazon, right? Incredible company, blew up, right? If you think about what I think, and I don't know if others share this opinion, but I think one of the secrets of their success is that they removed friction from the buying process, right? They literally implemented a one-click buy. Now, obviously, you're not going to implement a one-click buy in an enterprise software, but for what it needed to do, like it does not get better than that unless it like just knows that you need something and it buys it for you, right? Like I think that's the only less friction process of doing this. So it's the same thing for your process, right? So, you have to enable your champion when you're not in the room. And I think that's really like at the core, what we do with, customer collaboration, 80-90% of the time, you're not involved in those conversations, right?
Yep.
I read a stat the other day. I think it was like Harvard Business Review or something similar where, almost 80% of champions felt unarmed or not armed enough when they went selling internally. Right. And like, we're like, oh, but we send them these PDFs and we do this. And yeah, it's lost in some email thread somewhere, right? Like they're not looking through that stuff, right? You just spent an hour pitching them on the value. They love it. They go to their boss. They are not a salesperson. They say, oh, it's this cool thing that's going to help us
It's
with.
neat.
Yeah, it's $50,000. No. Right. Like that's the conversation. Right. And then so you have something that solves a need, but then it falls apart because that need and that value isn't properly, disseminated through an organization. One thing we've really started doing, and I think starting to push the boundary on this is, like medic, right? Like usually those are internal fields in your CRM that no one else is using, right? It's like, okay, great.
Yeah,
like, what is the close date, et cetera. We've actually started flipping that on its head and making those fields that we present to the champion and the customer and being like, hey, help us fill in our CRM with you, right? Let us collaborate on what this looks like so we can have, and maybe we don't put economic buyer, we have another title for it, but it's now like your CRM fields should be exposed to the customer, right? You should have that transparency and alignment. And that's where I think customer collaboration really comes in is, removing the friction and giving people the ability to just move at their own speed and get things done.
Yeah. Because I think that this is like when people talk about like thoughtful stages in a sales process, usually one thing that's kind of like a good rule of thumb is it's an action that the customer takes. It's not an action that you take. And the reason why is because like that will combat happy ears. Right? Oh, I did a demo, right? Or I sent a proposal. Right?
40% chance to
send a
close.
proposal.
Right.
Did you send a proposal or did they ask for a proposal?
Yeah.
Oh, no, they didn't ask for it. Oh, got it. You just like shoved it in their hands because versus like, whoa, Mark, this is really cool. Hey, can we talk about pricing and what a commercial relationship might look like? Well, shit, now you have my attention.
Yeah.
Right. Like the status of that deal is very different than the other deal. And I think that, one thing that someone had asked about earlier, in the kind of the pre-show questions was around forecasting, right? And kind of like deal inspection around these things. And I think that, for the most part, a lot of organizations will use like, forecasting and deal inspection as like rep story time. And so one way to do that is to like ask, like, what action did they take? And then the rep has to relay it. But I think there's an interesting thing here, which is like, or did the customer actually take that action in some sort of software? Like they filled out that CRM field, right? Through some collaboration software or what have you.
Well, so I think, it's really interesting, right? So, most of us have 5-6 stages in our Salesforce, right? And it's like, oh, we get to stage 4, it's 70% chance to close, right? Like the truth of the matter is each of those stages may have 20 steps that have to be done, right? So a stage is not a stage.
Sub stages. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, you could have 2 different deals that are in the procurement stage in Salesforce that are completely opposite and that should be forecasted completely different, right? So not only do you have to look at it from a kind of micro environment of like what's actually happening within that stage, right? But you also, I think this is where, we've kind of coined the term buyer-centric forecasting, because that's what it is, right? It's what is the buyer doing and where are you in their priorities? Because they'll tell you through engagement, right? If one of my reps is coming to me and saying, oh my God, this is a 100% chance to close, we'll close it on June 30th. And then we look at the engagement and our customers never once engaged in the PDFs that we sent them, or done any of the actions, or shared it with anyone else internally, or had these conversations. There's no way in hell that's closing January 30th, right? So it really gives you kind of like a lie detector, I think, into what's actually happening in your deals.
Yeah. One of the things, I don't know, I need to write this like blog post on like why forecasting is dead, or like why forecasting is, and one of the big things, so like, I think what you're describing is, well posed there. The other thing that kind of like drives me insane about the way that most organizations go about forecasting is like, it's just like the summation of a bunch of opinions as well. Like, because if you think about what it is, it's like, cool, you can scrub the hell out of the deals like we're talking about right there. But then even with that, what you're kind of doing is like, you're just adding up a bunch of these deals at like different times, like the ones for this month, the one for the next month, one for the next quarter, et cetera, et cetera. But you're not really like doing anything about like why that forecast is that way. And if you think about that, like there's deal level coaching and inspection, and then a resolution. Oh, Mark, you should do XYZ. Oh, Mark, you should do ABC here. But then the other thing too is you have to up level it one step and say, hey, why is the rep always doing these things on all of his deal, right? And so it's like coaching the human as opposed to coaching the deal. And that's oftentimes like people get just like, they get so like tunnel visioned around like deal inspection and like deal strategy and what have you, versus like up leveling and saying, actually, it turns out that this rep's like, conversion rate out of proposal, for example, is like half as much as everybody else is on the team. WTF. And so like you kind of like miss that forest for the trees if you're like just like looking like deal by deal by deal by deal with that rep, instead of being like, oh gosh, we had this pipeline review a week ago, and like, and then some of those deals disappeared that were in forecast, and then it happened again and happened again. That's kind of a hard thing to derive. Whereas if you look at like the rep as an individual, and like look at their metrics holistically, you would be able to see, oh, okay, this rep has this pathology right here. If we fix that pathology, lo and behold, it will have benefits across all of his pipe, right? If you like, okay, this rep has a problem with like things getting out of proposal. Why is that? Oh, because there's an exit criteria issue here, and like, they're just shoving things into that stage when they just like willy-nilly send out proposals or what have you. Or alternatively, this they get far in they get far into the sales process without actually having like really great pain points identified through meaningful discovery, and then like figure out what that is and then coach the resolution of whatever, and then bird dog the metric there and see if it like changes over time. So it's like, hey, you've got this problem with like, win rate out of proposal as compared to your team. You've got a problem with like untouched opportunities because you are a pig, right? Your pipeline is a pig pen, right? And so we're gonna calendar like 2 hours, twice a week. That's literally like pig pen time, and I'm going to hold you accountable for this metric being lower, right? And so this is why like the focus on forecasting and like that kind of being that higher order bit, as opposed to like data-driven management and coaching of the individual, oftentimes is kind of like tunnel vision.
Yeah. Well, and the most important aspect of that is you first need a way to be able to come to those data-driven decisions and to be able to have apples to apples conversations, right? Because if you don't actually have the insight into what's going on, how are you going to have these improvements, right? If every deal is different and it's not apples to apples, it's apples to watermelons, right? Like you're not able to have those conversations and level up. And so you can't improve what you can't measure, first and foremost, right? And I think that's where it really like, you have to start there. And then absolutely, right? And then let's take that a step further, right? Like, hey, our North America team is doing this really well, but we're losing deals in stage 3. Whereas our, Southwest Pacific team or whatever is, excelling at getting, from POC to close. Let's dig in and find out why. Right. But I think it all starts with being able to actually measure and get that visibility.
Yeah, and have consistency. Well, and so yeah, we kind of talked about the importance of like actually documenting that recipe or documenting that blueprint and making it easily accessible to reps so they can follow it. And yeah, like 5 stages, each of which is composed of like 15 steps. If you only have like 5 stages, that's obviously like you're missing all that nuance. What are the other kind of like biggest mistakes you see, sellers and sales teams doing around kind of like, a seller like collaborating with the customer or not, or what have you?
Yeah, I think whether you use a platform for it or spreadsheets or whatever, I think the biggest mistake is not selling collaboratively, right? Not having the belief that, this actually benefits the customer, right? Like, we talk to reps, every day where they're like, well, how do I know that my customer will want to be like, I don't want to be like a bully and like commanding this. And it's like, well, no, that's not the way to think about it, right? Everything you're doing should be removing friction and enabling your buyer, right? Like not giving them that is like the equivalent of spending all this time and energy on advertising, getting them to, a customer to walk in the store and then the aisles are empty and they just have to fend for themselves, right? It's like, no, like you need to be a supportive, trusted advisor during this process. And if the customer's not willing to work with you on that, get them out of your pipeline, right? Go focus on deals that are actually moving somewhere and that you have that mutual trust, right? So I think first off, creating a mutual action plan early and sharing it often is the number one thing, right? It gets you alignment. It shows that you know what you're doing. It creates trust and it creates visibility, right? So I think that's the number one thing. Number two, I think is going back to what we talked about earlier, right? Just not arming the champions, right? Giving them an ability to sell internally when you're not in the room. I think it's those two simple things, right? Like you do that and already you're going to start seeing big lifts.
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons why reps are like hesitant to do like the collab, like to use a kind of a collaborative approach is like they don't want to be told no.
Yeah.
Right. Like they don't want, because it like hurts their feelings, which I get, right? Like, but this is I think so much of like bad sales behaviors comes down to like trying to avoid the ego hit of someone saying no. Whereas, as the old saying is like the only thing that's like better than a yes is a fast no.
Yeah.
Right.
100%.
Versus being like strung along. And so what's fantastic about, being more collaborative in, and using software there is like, you can literally see what's going on.
Yeah.
Right. Like, it's like the software is like kind of doing the strip lining for you, where it's kind of like, hey, Bob, you said that, we had a timeline on like, so the security review was supposed to be done, last Friday. And, I'd rather be more realistic than optimistic here. Is this still a priority, or, should we just put this bad boy on ice? Like, you're not going to hurt my feelings.
Yeah.
And if the prospect comes back and is like, oh no, like, my kid got sick and you're like, great, cool. But if the prospect comes out, he's like, honestly, Mark, like, I don't want to blow smoke up your ass. Like, I think things have been moving around a little bit. I think it would be right for us to kind of put this on, on ice. Okay, great. Like maybe we don't fold right. Maybe we don't fold right there. We say, oh, wonderful. Yeah. Like, I just threw 15 minutes on the calendar. Let's just talk about it live. We can align, et cetera, et cetera. I like totally hear what you're saying, but at least like now we're having a bunch of different conversation versus just like sitting around. Like, we thought this thing was potentially on cruise control, but like now we actually know that that's not the case, and we can act accordingly, right?
Well, and exactly right. And I think there's leading indicators that lead up to that, right? You're seeing things not get done. You're seeing engagement drop, right? So you're able to start having those conversations before. And maybe what if you would have caught it, 2 weeks early? You're like, hey, Pete, I noticed you haven't actually been, I imagine things comes up, you haven't been as active as you were in the past couple of weeks. Like, is this still a priority? Oh, well, we're thinking about priorities shifting, because here's what we're talking about. Great. Well, let's hop on a call. And now we're having this conversation 2 weeks earlier before it's already now, the internal committee decided that this is no longer an issue. What if you would have had that conversation?
Yeah, the door closed.
Yeah, exactly. And now in the next week when the meeting happens, they go, actually, I just met with Pete and they brought up some really good points. XYZ, this is why we should focus on it. All right. So at the end of the day, I mean, time kills all deals, right? So as earlier as you can get ahead of this, and again, just have that mutual trust, right? Like sales should be collaborative. And I think in 2 or 3 years, like this is just going to be how every organization sells, right? Like 5 years ago, only the top teams were using a sales engagement platform like Outreach or Salesloft. Now it's table stakes and you can't compete without it. Same thing for a customer collaboration, same thing for an intelligence tool, same thing for all these other tools. Like it's just going to be the tech stack, right? Either you adapt or you die, right? And that's really the way it goes. And so like, yeah.
When you're talking about the arming of the champion, I mean, I think that's a lot of times, I think reps kind of get nervous around like, am I providing too many materials? Am I providing not enough materials? Right? How do you think about like what the right amount of armament, if you will, is for a prospect?
I think more is better almost always, right? Like, and I think, it's going to be an iterative process for a team. They're going to find out what works when, right? You don't want to, and it's not just bombarding with 50 different PDFs at the beginning. It's okay, let's show as we go, right? We have these different PDFs. We're going to maybe unlock this when we get here. We realize that, hey, when we share this case study, it helps, drive our close rate. But I think almost always having more information is better than none. The problem is a lot of the times this is just scattered through inboxes, right? You send 3 PDFs here, you send 5 here. Like your champion's going to their boss. They're not going to search through 20 different email threads, right? Like give it to them in a single place, let them pull it up, let them bookmark it. And then they go, hey, great. Oh, you wanted to know about that? Actually, that's a great question. I didn't even think to ask my rep that. Oh, you know what? It's here. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's so much of this is like getting away from like the mega email or like the mega, I call it a working thread, right? Like where you have like your email thread, which is like the one that's associated with the deal, and you're just like working like, and that's essentially what you do is you kind of create this like a creative document. The problem is, of course, is that like it's just like replies and replies and replies and replies and replies and replies and replies. And I think that's So when I think about this and like what I coach my reps on with respect to kind of assets is one, you want them to be very like bespoke and custom. So one of the cool things with Atrium is it takes like 3 minutes to turn on an Atrium account, right? So like we sell on customer data, right? Like they show up, they connect their Salesforce account, they've got an Atrium account, we call it a free, hey, let's set up a free Atrium account for you, right? There's it's on for 2 to 4 weeks depending on kind of like the process or what have you. But what comes out of it, of course, is like a bunch of assets. Like, oh cool, you were concerned about these reps who are ramping right now. You were right to be concerned because look at Bobby right here, right? And like those assets then go into, and then of course what we do is like, oh, okay, wonderful. You were concerned about ramping. Here are some ramping assets that have now been like, here's a ramping dashboard and here's a ramping alert feed and here's some goals associated with that. Oh, you were worried about account executive prospecting, right? Because in the current economic environment, like inbound, there's less inbound. You want your AEs to be spending their time doing outbound when they're not having customer facing meetings. Wonderful. Well, here are the assets that we created associated with that tie to those discovered pain points and those priorities right here. And so just making sure that it's like present right there in that asset. And then of course, like, so you have those custom things, the other custom things as well, like, an ROI study. And then there's less custom things that are tied to the priorities, right? Oh, cool. You care about, measuring the ramp of your account executives in addition to these assets that have been created in Atrium for your team, right? Did you want to keep them or did you want us to turn off the account? Here is also a white paper that talks about how to measure the success of a ramping team. And here is a case study that is specifically focused on helping organization, like why an organization that measured their ramps more effectively was able to compress ramp times for these AEs and then offboard reps that weren't going to make it, that much more quickly, right? But it's like tied to the use cases and then sitting there in that that collaborative workspace. So that way it's like, all right, cool. Like here's the argument, right? Here's the whole commercial argument for why this should happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's showing them their reality, right? It's not just like, oh, here's like something that can be. It's like, no, this is actual data. Let's go ahead and go live with it, right? Like you're seeing what you see is what you get, right? And I think there's so much power to that. I mean, we do the same thing, right? Like when customers come in, we're giving them free trials, we're getting them set up. We're saying, okay, great, let's create a template for your workflow, right? You have all this like disjointed process, right? Like, which is, to go on another tangent, but like we have so much standardization at the top of the funnel, right? We have cold call scripts, we have emails, we have ads, we have all of this, standardization. And then when we get into an opportunity, it flies out the window, right? And you have 5 reps, you have 10 different processes, right? So it's like, how do we take that, standardize it, and give it all really just in one place? And like, so for us, when we set up customers, like we'll actually go through, we'll take their process, we'll spin up a template in 10, 15 minutes together, and we go, okay, great, here's what it could look like, let's build from it, right? And they're like, oh my God, thank you, like this is actually using our data, we're using Medic, so we're using that framework, or hey, we're using Sandler, great, let's include that, right? It helps.
How quickly, and so when somebody sets up a recapped account, it sounds like what you guys are doing is like taking their current, maybe like disjointed, or maybe not, disjointed is probably the wrong word. It's more like undeclared, like undocumented, like they have a process. It's just not yet, it's just like not yet documented. And then you guys reduce it into documentation. Does that usually like, does that reveal things to folks like, oh man, we actually have like multiple processes here, we probably should align on like one, right? Or a set of recipes, or what do people discover through that process?
It's a great question. I think the biggest thing one is the number one answer always is like, well, we have a process, but it's not as formal as we want it to be, and no one's following it, right? Like that's almost always the response. I think it's an excellent question. I mean, what it usually uncovers is that there's way more variance than people realize, right? It's like every single rep has a different process for every single different deal size that they're doing, right? And like it's, you have 5 reps running 5 different processes for 3 different go-to-market segments. You have 150 variations, right? Like, and then each one of those deals has 150 steps that have to be completed. You're literally juggling thousands of things. Like, how the hell do you ensure that nothing falls through the cracks? Right? You can't, right? So I think like the biggest uncovery is that people realize like, holy shit, this is a much bigger problem than I thought it was, right? Like I just thought, we were doing a good job. Come to find out, like 20% of my reps are actually following a great process, 80% aren't. So if I'm a hot lead that I come in, I have an 80% chance going to, wherever, right? Like nowhere land, essentially. Right. And again, in this economy, you cannot afford that. You have to flip that, right?
What so I think that from a maturity model standpoint, I think what I'm hearing here is like, hey, look, we can we help them coalesce what might be kind of a loosely documented or kind of like fuzzy sales process or what have you, and then it becomes crisp. What about like situations where there are like crisp variations? Like I'll give you an example. So Atrium, we kind of like bucket our customers into 4 tiers actually, but like usually based on like their sales operational maturity, because usually like sales ops is kind of charged with helping the business use metrics to improve performance. So if an organization doesn't have any sales operations people in-house, usually it's a pretty good sign that they don't really have any sort of like metrics or analytics happening. So we call that a tier 1. And if there's a single sales operations person, usually like they have specific needs, like they're busier than a one-legged kickboxer, we call that a tier 2. And then organizations that have like a handful of sales operations people, we'll call that a tier 3. And organizations that have like more than 10, and usually this is obviously like, it correlates the number of reps as well, but the sales processes are different for those, right? And so I would imagine that like when you guys start getting into like, and this is probably like outside of a sales process, is probably actually when somebody becomes a customer, they start like having different playbooks and what have you that are like subcategories of the sales process. How do folks go about that?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. So some of the feedback or we get this feedback all the time from customers, right? They're like, look, the platform, love it. It's great. It's fantastic. But what was really helpful is the, sitting down and coming up with a strategy of what great actually looks like, and using this as like a forcing function of getting all these things that are maybe in 5 different people's heads, putting it down into a single place. And then from that, like segmenting different things, right? Like you mentioned, like we have a bunch of customers that have, they have multi-product go-to-markets, right? So like one thing we always do for them is we set up templates that have maybe 5 products for them. 4 of them are hidden. They have their default, land and expand model. But when it becomes, relevant, oh, great, here's everything that we need. Oh, you want, this conference tool, or you want this, cold call, framework, whatever it is, right? Like, great, let's unlock that and let's talk through it, right? And again, it just comes back to, empowering your reps to be able to know how to do that. Because if I just joined an organization, I'm 4 months into my ramp, I have no idea what the difference is between the different products, right? Like I might have a handle on 1 or 2, but not 5, right? And so for us, like we make it really easy. We're like, okay, great, you bombard us, we'll go in, we'll create everything for you. We present you V1, and over the next 90 days, like we're gonna get to V2 just through iterations, right? And like for me, what I always love seeing is, when we come back in and we do like a QBR with a customer, and they're like, yeah, we actually started with this template, but what was really interesting is this one rep had their own variation that kind of like ran away with it, and now they have like this really cool thing that we're now implementing for everybody else, right? And so like seeing those stories, it's really cool because again, you're giving people freedom, and to be creative, and like, I think sales is just as much art as it is science, right? It's, you need both. But
Yeah, the one of the things that we talk about with our customers is, as a manager, there's kind of like 2 major things that you have to do. One is, these are at least with like your ramped reps. Like for reps that are ramping, you just got to bird dog the hell out of your reps, right? For the reps that are ramped, what you have to do is, 1, you gotta like detect issues, diagnose what the root cause is, and then fix it. And then on the flip side, for the folks who are outperforming, what you have to do is take their fingerprint of success and say like, hey, why is this? So first, identify that outperformance, like, oh, okay, this rep right here, and this is, Atrium does some kind of like programmatic root cause analysis, like, hey, Mark, this rep is outperforming from a booking standpoint because their win rate out of this stage right here is much higher than everybody else's, and also their ASP is a little bit higher. By the way, it's not like they're doing more work, they're just like higher conversion, but specifically in these areas right here. And then, conversely, this rep over here, they're just actually outperforming other folks because they have this many more customer facing meetings that are happening, and that's cool. But I think what that reveals is that, like, this person may not be magic, they're just able to, like, they're doing this, can we get everybody else to do it as well? So that's like a really important thing that it's, to your point about like, you can't really take your top performers and make them like top performers, because there's only like 40 or 50 hours in the week, you run out of time, right?
And
but what you can do is
you
can shift them back to, you can shift their behaviors to the other folks.
Exactly. And listen, even if you do focus on making your 5 top reps, like from A to A plus, you're still only talking about an impact of 5 reps. Right now, if you take your, everybody else, the average, and there's 25 of them, even if you make a smaller net increase, it's just covering more surface area, right? So it just ends up having a bigger transformational impact. And also, like, we're in sales, right? We know, like, when I was on the team, right? Like, if I was a top rep, like, I was walking around like I was, king of the hill, right? Like, good luck trying to get me to improve, right? Like, I was young, like, but
exactly.
If I wasn't hitting my numbers, all of a sudden that changes the dynamic, right? So
yeah, and I think what ends up happening though is, this is where, so it's one thing to, like, if you identify, I'll give you an example, like, because Atrium is, because again, it's super easy to turn on Atrium. It takes like 3 minutes to set up an account. Literally, what our reps do in their first disco calls, like probably 50% of the time, somebody's already turned on an account before the disco call. On the flip side, where a rep like gets a meeting on the calendar, SDR puts a meeting on the calendar or whatever, they're focused on like lighting up data. That's what we call it. Light up the data, light it up, right? And And so one of the reason why that's become such a key part of our sales motion is because one of our reps was just like very, very, very aggressive about doing that. And in retrospect, it's kind of obvious, like, cool, if you turn on an account for them and they can see their own data and they can see the fact that this rep right here has this pipe hygiene issue and this rep right here has this ramping issue, then of course, like, seeing is believing. But this was like, I don't know, like a year plus ago or what have you. And so what was funny was this rep was like outperforming from a booking standpoint, but actually his win rates weren't, like, his win rates out of the like stage, like the pilot stage, was actually lower than everybody else's. But the total number of ops that he was getting into that stage was just so much higher because he was just like a bulldog on that front. And like ended up it was like a 30% or like a 25% outperformance as compared to the rest of the team. So we were like, okay, cool. We standardized on that. Now the way that we did that was like mantras, right? We talk about it, like light it up, right? Like light it up, show them the light, close it down, do it again. That's like our internal mantra. But having it declared in the playbook where it's like, hey, your number one thing that you're seeking to do right now is like you're trying to light up data. And then the next step is that you're gonna tie the assets in Atrium to their pain points here, right? All of what those are is sort of like an accretion of a bunch of like innovation that various reps have done. But rather than it being like ephemeral out in the world, it's like turned into an actual playbook such that the new rep comes in, sits down and see it and is like, oh, okay, here's this recipe. Well, what that recipe is it's the combined effort of like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of customer facing meetings across like, a dozen reps over the last like 3 years, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think so much of it comes back again, like, you mentioned earlier, right? Like the fear that reps have, right? They're like, oh, like, what if I have this, showing them that and then showing them the outcomes of that, like at the end of the day, like as a rep, like your job isn't to inflate your forecast numbers as high as possible. Your job is to bring revenue in. Who cares if you're closing 3 out of 3 deals or you're closing 5 out of, however, right? Like what matters is the end result. So to your point, right, like, yes, their booking percentage might have been lower, but they're still outperforming at the end of the goal, right? And that's what matters, right? Like, so optimize for that, not for this other like vanity metrics, right? Like, we had a conversation with, our marketing team, we were thinking through, we were like, okay, like we realized we were focusing so much on leads and not actually what those leads were converting. And it's like, if those leads don't convert, yes, we may have brought in 1,000 leads, but who cares, right? Like, it doesn't. I'd rather bring in 5 leads, work them much better, and have opportunity cost of not working them go towards something else. So
yeah, and I think this is one of the things that ends up. Oftentimes managers are kind of like afraid, especially when you have like junior managers who are like promoted AEs or whatever. Oftentimes they're kind of like afraid to be the heavy and say like, hey, look, like you may have a spidey sense, like, hey, this rep isn't like working hard enough, or hey, this rep's like, this rep isn't working hard enough, or like, I kind of have a feeling that this rep has like a pipeline hygiene problem because I'm CC'd on these threads and I'm like, he hasn't, I haven't seen an email to the Lockheed deal in the last like 2 weeks or whatever. But oftentimes like those managers will be kind of like hesitant. They're like, I don't know. I don't want to be like the dick, et cetera. Whereas if you have like the data sitting right there, it's like, look, dog, you have 15 untouched ops. Everybody else has 2. Like, come now. and by the way, like, look,
right? Like,
and then moreover, you have the same number of ops as everybody else, right? It's not like you're, like you have like opportunities like falling out of your ears or whatever, and like you're overloaded. Like, we got to fix this thing right here. That can really help a manager have backbone and let me like, look, I'm coaching you up here. It's not because I'm the heavy. It's not because like I'm the big bad wolf or whatever. I want to help you win. Also, here's this data right here that's showing me this, right? And I think that that's the same sort of thing that you're describing. It's like, hey, like the reason why this step exists in our sales process, in our, in our playbooking software or whatever, is because, Jeff had this thing that he figured out 6 months ago, and it led to these higher win rates or, this better level of efficiency or whatever. And that's why now it's part of our process right here. It's not because like, I'm just like making stuff up,
Yeah, it's funny. Actually, I had a conversation last week with a sales leader, and they were like, "Well, we like to let the reps kind of choose, the tools that they implement." And I'm like, "Yeah, listen, I think that's great, but at the end of the day, like your job as a leader is to lead, right? Like, are reps also choosing what days they come in? Are they choosing, what like CRM system you're using? Are they choosing how often they get paid? Like, no, like there are best practices that you as a leadership team found out,
Mhm.
right? And so like you come to them like, here's what we decided. We believe that this methodology is going to work. You now use it. We believe that this way of selling, whether it's collaborative selling or whatever, is going to be the best. You now have two choices. You can use a, Google Sheet, or you can use a platform, whatever it is, right? But like, you still have to lead, right? And you have to enable them and make those hard decisions. Like, that's why you're the leader, right? It's not to be
Yeah.
everyone's best friend. And like, your number one job as a trainer, as a manager, is to bring out the best in your reps. That's it. Right. And like,
Yeah,
sometimes that means you have to
that's
make,
not like, yeah, I was gonna say that's not like,
yeah,
and the way you don't do that by being like, all right, do whatever,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like, could you imagine like a sport, like, an
no,
athletic,
yeah,
coach doing that? Like, no, this is how we run these plays, and like, you did it wrong, so please do it again. And like, here,
yeah,
let's go ahead, and here, you can watch me do it right here. Now, can you do it 10 times? And we're gonna coach you on it.
yeah,
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, Mark, we're out of time. That was super fun, man. I appreciate it. I told you it would like super fly by.
yeah,
Everybody, thanks for joining us. We have next week we've got another really fantastic guest, Sarah Bush. She's the head of revenue operations for Sonar. She used to be head of RevOps at 15Five. She's a really smart cookie there. So we're going to be talking about all sorts of like sales operations nerdery there. So,
yeah.
Mark, have a great rest of your week, and like have an awesome weekend. Okay, man.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me. And we'll talk soon.
Okay, take care.
All right.
Bye.
Yep. Bye.